Thanks for your company. In our first story, 16 U.S. senators have written to their government asking it to roll out a strategy to stop China from supporting infrastructural projects in developing countries in the form of loans. They say the initiative amounts to weaponizing capital and described it as a predatory Chinese infrastructure financing. The letter to the U.S. Secretaries of Treasury and State comes at a time when Ghana is signing a $2 billion battle loan facility with Chinese state firm Sinohydro. Here is a news desk report.
Quoting the Center for Global Development, the senators led by Chuck Grassley of Iowa and Joe Dinelli of Indiana said Chinese behavior as a creditor has not been subject to the disciplines and standards that other major sovereign and multilateral creditors have adopted collectively, and usually results in rising debt levels in developing countries and dependence on China. The senators expressed worry countries like Djibouti have fallen in such traps, resulting in their debt to GDP ratio increasing from 50 to 85%, the highest for any low-income country, and putting them at risk of losing their major port to China. The senators warned there is an attempt by China to weaponize capital in Africa, Asia, and Europe, saying one of the key tools for doing this has been the China Export-Import Bank. They are asking the U.S. government to provide a plan on how it can use its power as the largest contributor to the International Monetary Fund to prevent the continuation of ongoing such Belt Road Initiative projects in developing countries. They also want a clear plan on how the U.S. government can educate developing countries about the risk of Chinese infrastructure loans and provide alternative funding to them. The senators claim China, through these initiatives, is seeking to create an economic world order ultimately dominated by China, and called on the U.S. government to counter the attempts to hold other countries financially hostage and force ransoms out of them.
My colleague Fred Smith joins me in studio with a copy of that letter. And Fred, the senators claim that a statement made by the Chinese president to the 19th Party Congress were false. And they're also saying that China wants to create a world economic order. Tell us more about that.
Well, in this statement, it says in the speech to the 19th Party Congress, President Xi declared that, quote, China's development does not pose a threat to any other country. No matter what stage of development it reaches, China will never seek hegemony or engage in expansion. It is apparent that this statement is fundamentally false. This according to the letter written to the House Speaker. Well, he said the statement is false, and that the goal of the BRI is the Belt and Road Initiative, is the creation of an economic world order, ultimately dominated by China. It is imperative that the United States counters China's attempts to hold other countries financially hostage and force ransoms that further its geostrategic goals.
Interesting.
We look forward to your prompt and thorough response to these inquiries, as well as any actions you plan to take on them.
All right, and Fred, the report we just played detailing what the senators put in that letter made reference to Djibouti. They gave an example. Is that the only example they give in their letter?
No, it says in 2016, the IMF agreed to a $1.5 billion bailout loan with Sri Lanka due to unsustainable debts to China. Recently, it has been reported that the incoming government of Pakistan will pursue an IMF bailout in part due to rising current account deficit and external debt obligations caused by the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor projects. These financial crises illustrate the dangers of China's debt-trap democracy and its Belt and Road Initiative to developing countries, as well as the national security threats they pose to the United States.
Basically trying to build the relationship between China's support to developing countries and how these countries come back to the IMF for bailouts. And obviously we know that the US is the biggest contributor to the IMF. Fred, I'll come back to you to give us some more details on this letter. We are joined by Dr. Eche Sikanku. He's an international relations expert. Good morning, sir. Thanks for your time.
Hi, good morning.
Legitimate concerns or a panic reaction to the possibility of China creating a new economic world order?
The U.S. as a country or an institution is guarded by its own national foreign policy interest, right? So the actions of any government or any institution or any political actor are always dictated by certain national interests. So as to whether these concerns are going to be judged as legitimate or not have to be taken from that perspective. These are United States senators acting in American interest. But be that as it may, I think that concerns have been raised largely, not just about the economic arrangements or the financial arrangements of these loans, but also the political, social, and security ramifications of these particular arrangements. And I think that that is probably what the United States is trying to do. They see a China which is on the rise. They see a China which is making forays into the African continent, and they see a dwindling of the United States' own influence in Africa. In other words, the threat to the U.S. as a global superpower and an influencer or shipper in the agenda of global issues and global international affairs is being threatened by the continuous rise of China on the global scene. And I think that from an international relations and from a political perspective, that might be what should be influencing or underpinning the letter that has been written by the senators.
Okay, now let's bring it home. Even though it's not stated clearly in that letter, do you think countries like Ghana, because our president is in China now, signing some of these agreements and doing business with the Chinese, do you think that this may be a subtle signal to developing countries that are doing business with China on how to go about it from the U.S. perspective?
Yes. I think that if we want to contextualize it or bring it home, at the end of the day, it speaks to our own abilities to renegotiate and engage with nations on the global scene. The question that needs to be asked is that, is this another scramble for Africa being redone in another way in different colors, but still the same thing? Does this further enhance Africa's own stature as a dependent continent? So does this promote the narrative of dependency, or Africa as the begging basket or the begging bowl that our leaders stretch out to the rest of the world? It's just that now this bowl has been stretched out to a different master, so to speak. So I think that the conversation that we need to have at home should revolve around that. And then thirdly, how does this affect our own internal national interests and security interests? How does that affect industrialization in Africa? How does that affect food security in Africa? And how does that affect our own growth and development as a nation? Because the concern has always been that Africa must begin to look within itself, or Africa must begin to promote intra-African trade and industrialization as a panacea to our development, instead of holding the begging bowl all the time. Because let's face it, trade or aid has never developed any nation. And so I think that as far as our own situation is concerned, that is what we should begin to be talking about. What are the effects of all these deals? What kind of impact is it going to have on our local communities? Because there is a direct relationship between the activities of Chinese nationals, whether it is galamsey or bauxite mining, or if it is retail, or whatever the activities are here in Ghana. There is a direct effect economically, there is a direct effect on the environment, there is a direct effect politically, because you know that China has always paid a blind eye to the human rights record and the democratic credentials of nations that they have often dealt with. The argument has that they have always been in bed or have been either unwilling or unable to hold government to account, especially when they have been dictatorial or have trampled upon the rights of their own people. And so how does that promote even the internal political dynamics of countries where they are willing to cast a blind eye on or dictatorial and authoritarian regimes? So really, the impact cuts across,
finally,
both economically, socially, and politically.
Finally, Doc, let's look at what these senators or America itself is likely to do to try and, as it were, restrict China from having this economic world order that they describe. Now, we know that quite recently the relationship between China and the U.S. has gone downhill with the introduction of different economic tariffs and trade legislation by the current president there, Donald Trump. What are we likely to see, that is, if the demands of these senators are not met?
It is a big deal in several respects. Again, so let me start from the political respect. The U.S. always has a huge influence in the international system when it comes to international organizations such as the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund, because they are either major contributors or major underwriters of these institutions. So they seem to determine policy and influence plans and programs of these institutions. So what it does, it means is that the concerns of the senators might end up influencing the IMF's own dealings with Ghana and with the rest of the African nations. Already they've cited examples with Angola, Sri Lanka, and all of that. And we also know that the donors community, the Bretton Woods institutions, have been a major funding source for the things that we do here in Ghana, whether it is our budget. When you read the State of the Nation address, you notice the amount or the percentage of it that is being underwritten by these Bretton Woods institutions or donor agencies. So there is a very, very, very direct link between whatever is going on there, even when it comes to the United Nations, as to whether they will support institutions such as the UNFPA, which is interested in curbing adolescent sexual problems, HIV/AIDS prevention, maternal mortality, population growth, and all of that. You see the funds that they have. All of this is the U.S. government, which needs approval by the United States Senate to be able to engage in some of these things. They are the key framers or the key actors in this policy, because if the Senate does not approve some of these things, the president cannot go ahead.
All right. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Sekanku. He's an international relations expert, helping us understand really what all this is about. So Fred Smith is still here with me. Finally, there are some questions the senators want answered in this letter.
Indeed. Number one on the list is, how do you plan to raise the dangers of Chinese infrastructure financing through the BRI with the IMF? Do you believe that additional countries will ask for a bailout from the IMF due to BRI? Which countries are these? As the largest contributor to the IMF, how can the United States, and this question is crucial, use its influence to ensure that the bailout terms prevent the continuation of ongoing BRI projects or the start of new BRI projects? How can the United States work with allies and partners to educate countries about the risks of Chinese infrastructure loans? And how can the United States work with allies and partners to assist countries struggling to repay debts due to BRI? How can the United States work with allies and partners to present an alternative to developing nations regarding investment and infrastructure funding? And these questions were added to the letters they sent because they said there's IMF's potential bailout of Pakistan in the coming months.
Thank you very much. JoyNews editor Fred Smith, they're helping us understand this letter that the 16 senators wrote to their secretaries of state and treasury. Definitely a lot of analysis, even from the business angle in subsequent bulletins.